Nadine Ferris noticed, over the course of a single ordinary month, that she had started rehearsing what she would say before her own children came to visit. Not because anything was wrong, because somewhere along the way, without a single dramatic moment she could point to, she had begun quietly managing herself in advance of their opinions. This is the story of the 7 signs that finally helped her see it clearly. This is her story, still unfolding. Nadine is 68, divorced for 20 years, a former craftswoman who went on to teach art at a public school for 25 years before retiring 4 years ago. She lives alone in a small adobe house in New Mexico that she renovated herself, room by room, over nearly 3 decades. Her 2 adult children, Owen, 42, and Renata, 38, both live in the same town, and both are present, loving, attentive presences in her life. This is not a story about neglect or abandonment. It is a story about the opposite, presence delivered in exactly the wrong shape, one quiet adjustment at a time. Nadine had raised both children largely on her own after her divorce, teaching art by day and taking on small pottery commissions by night to make ends meet during the leaner years. Independence was never simply a preference for her. It was the skill that had gotten her and her children through some genuinely difficult stretches. The muscle she'd exercised constantly for 2 decades before either child was old enough to leave home. It was, in some ways, the very thing she had modeled for them their entire lives, which made the current pattern all the more disorienting once she finally started to notice it clearly. The first sign Nadine noticed involved her phone, and it happened on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday when her old phone finally gave out after years of faithful service. Owen, an engineer by profession, offered immediately and warmly to set up her replacement, and Nadine, genuinely grateful to avoid the tedious process herself, happily accepted. What she received back several hours later looked considerably different than what she'd expected. Owen had removed several apps he considered unnecessary, disabled most notifications to reduce distraction, and reorganized her home screen entirely according to his own logic rather than hers. Gone was the news app she checked every morning with her coffee. Gone, too, was easy access to the photo editing app she'd used regularly to touch up pictures of her pottery for the small online shop she ran on the side. "This will be so much simpler for you, Mom," Owen said, handing back the phone with visible pride in his work. "Less clutter, less to think about." Nadine thanked him, genuinely appreciative of the effort, and spent the next several weeks quietly, awkwardly working around a phone that no longer functioned quite the way she actually wanted it to, not wanting to seem ungrateful for a gift so clearly given with love. She found herself, more than once during those weeks, hunting through unfamiliar menu screens trying to locate a setting Owen had buried during his reorganization, texting him small, embarrassed questions about how to find things that had once been perfectly intuitive to her on her old device. Each time, Owen responded quickly and helpfully, walking her through his own logic patiently, never once suggesting that perhaps the entire redesign hadn't actually been necessary in the first place. Nadine, for her part, never quite worked up the nerve to say so directly either. The second sign emerged more gradually, through her daughter, Renata, a professional interior designer whose eye for aesthetics and practicality had always been a genuine source of pride for Nadine. Over the course of several months, Small items around Nadine's house began quietly changing. A colorful, slightly worn rug Nadine had bought on a trip to Santa Fe decades earlier disappeared one week, replaced by a neutral, non-slip mat Renata described as so much safer for your floors. A collection of mismatched, sentimental picture frames gave way to a uniform, more contemporary set. Renata, an old, slightly creaky rocking chair that had belonged to Nadine's own mother, vanished from the living room entirely during a visit when Nadine happened to be at a doctor's appointment, replaced by a newer, more ergonomic chair Renata had researched carefully. Each individual change arrived with a reasonable, caring explanation. Together, accumulating quietly over months, they added up to something Nadine hadn't fully registered until her old friend and neighbor Dolores, visiting one afternoon, looked around the living room with obvious surprise. "Nadine, your house doesn't look like yours anymore," Dolores said, not unkindly, simply observing. "Where's your mother's rocking chair? Where's that rug you loved so much from Santa Fe?" Nadine looked around her own living room, as though seeing it freshly for the first time in months, and felt a small, disorienting jolt at how much had quietly shifted without her ever having made a single deliberate decision about any of it. She walked slowly through the rest of the house after Dolores left that afternoon, cataloging the changes room by room with the same careful attention she'd once brought to critiquing her students' compositions. The kitchen curtains she'd sewn herself, replaced with something from a catalog Renata favored, a shelf of hand-thrown pottery pieces, quietly rearranged into what Renata had described months earlier as a more curated display. None of it individually had felt like loss in the moment it happened. Seen all together, walking through her own home like a visitor cataloging someone else's choices, it felt like something considerably heavier. The third sign, once Nadine started paying closer attention, revealed itself in her own shopping habits, which had changed in a way she hadn't consciously noticed until examining the pattern directly. It had started innocently enough, nearly 2 years earlier, as a light-hearted habit, Nadine texting Renata a photo from a dressing room, half in fun, asking her daughter's opinion on a new blouse. Renata, with her genuine eye for style, offered thoughtful, helpful feedback, and the exchange had felt, at the time, like simple mother-daughter bonding. Somewhere over the following 2 years, though, the habit hardened into something closer to dependency. Nadine realized, examining her own recent behavior honestly, that she no longer purchased so much as a new sweater without first sending Renata a photo and waiting for approval. She had, without ever consciously deciding to, stopped trusting her own 68 years of personal taste, deferring instead to her daughter's judgment on nearly every personal purchase, however small. The fourth sign concerned her pottery studio, the small converted shed behind her house where Nadine had spent countless unstructured, deeply satisfying hours since retiring, throwing bowls and vases with no particular schedule or agenda, beyond her own inspiration in the moment. Owen, worried after Nadine mentioned once offhandedly that she'd lost track of time and missed dinner while absorbed in a project, decided to help by creating a structured pottery schedule for her. 2-hour blocks, clearly defined, with built-in breaks, presented to Nadine as a thoughtful solution to help her manage her energy better. "This way you won't overdo it, Mom," Owen explained, showing her the neatly organized calendar he'd created. "Structure is good for pacing yourself." Nadine had always considered the very absence of structure to be the entire point of her studio time, the freedom to lose herself completely in the clay for as long as inspiration lasted, without external boundaries imposed on her own creative rhythm. She said nothing critical about Owen's gift in the moment, not wanting to seem ungrateful, but found herself, in the weeks that followed, unconsciously watching the clock during her own studio sessions in a way she never had before. She noticed, too, that the quality of her work had subtly shifted since Owen's schedule took hold, her pieces becoming slightly more rushed, slightly less considered than the unhurried work she used to produce during the long, open afternoons she'd once had entirely to herself. She hadn't connected the two things at first, assuming it was simply a natural creative dry spell. Looking back later, she recognized the shift for what it actually was. Art made against a ticking clock someone else had set, rather than art made in the boundless, unstructured time that had always been the actual source of her best work. The fifth sign arrived through a conversation Nadine happened to overhear, rather than one she was actually included in. Passing by the kitchen one afternoon while Owen and Renata visited together, Nadine caught fragments of a conversation between her two children about hiring a regular gardener for her yard, discussing specific companies, comparing rates, debating which day of the week would work best, an entire decision already well underway before either of them had actually asked Nadine whether she wanted a gardener at all. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to her own household plans being discussed and nearly finalized without her, before finally stepping into the kitchen. "Were you planning to ask me about this at some point?" Nadine asked, her tone lighter than she actually felt. "Oh, Mom, of course! We were just narrowing down options first," Renata said quickly, though the specificity of the conversation Nadine had just overheard suggested a decision considerably further along than simple preliminary research. The sixth sign showed up repeatedly at family dinners in a pattern Nadine had noticed intermittently for months, but hadn't quite named until she started actively looking for it. When Nadine told stories from her own life, memories from her decades teaching art, funny anecdotes from raising Owen and Renata as a single mother, details from her own childhood, she found herself increasingly interrupted gently but persistently by one of her children correcting or clarifying some detail of a story Nadine remembered perfectly clearly herself. "Mom, I think that was actually the year before, wasn't it?" Owen would say confidently about an event Nadine had lived through directly and he had only heard about secondhand as a small child. Renata, similarly, would occasionally interject with her own version of a story from Nadine's teaching career, despite not having been present for any of it, simply because she'd heard the story told slightly differently on some previous occasion. Nadine began noticing that she had started qualifying her own memories preemptively, adding phrases like, "I think," or "if I remember right," to stories she actually remembered with complete confidence, subtly undermining her own authority over her own life's history before anyone else even had the chance to. She thought one evening, after a particularly persistent round of gentle correction from Owen about the exact year she'd opened her small pottery side business, about the peculiar unfairness of the whole exchange. She had lived that year, she had signed the lease, ordered the first batch of clay, taught her very first paying student in that same small studio. Owen had been perhaps 6 years old at the time, with no independent memory of any of it, beyond what she herself had told him over the years. And yet, in the moment, it had felt easier to simply concede the point than to insist again on the accuracy of her own lived experience. The seventh sign, and the one that finally made Nadine understand the full shape of what had been happening, was the quietest and most personal of all. She noticed, examining her own recent behavior with real honesty, that she had begun hiding certain small receipts in a kitchen drawer rather than leaving them visible on the counter, anticipating questions about a purchase before anyone had actually asked one. She realized she had stopped mentioning casually whenever she drove somewhere after dark, having absorbed, somewhere along the way, an unspoken sense that evening driving might draw concerned commentary she'd rather avoid. She caught herself, one particular evening, mentally rehearsing how she would explain an impulsive furniture purchase before either of her children had even seen it, constructing a defense for a decision that was, in every meaningful sense, entirely her own to make. She thought back, trying to identify when exactly this particular habit had first taken root, and found she genuinely couldn't locate a single starting point. It hadn't arrived through any specific confrontation or criticism. It had simply accumulated, the way sediment settles slowly at the bottom of still water, an almost imperceptible daily practice of pre-justifying herself that had become so habitual she'd stopped noticing she was doing it at all, until she finally sat down and counted up how often, in a single ordinary week, she found herself constructing explanations nobody had actually requested. It was her grandson, Caleb, 19, visiting one weekend from college, who finally said out loud what Nadine herself had been circling for weeks. Caleb had wandered into the kitchen while Nadine was quietly tucking a shopping receipt into a drawer, watching her with the particular bluntness only a 19-year-old seems able to access without any social hesitation. "Grandma, why do you hide stuff like that?" Caleb asked, genuinely curious rather than critical. "It's your money. Why do you act like you did something wrong?" Nadine opened her mouth to explain and found, to her own surprise, that she didn't actually have a good answer. "I don't know, honestly," she admitted. "I think I just got used to explaining myself before anyone asks." "That's kind of weird, Grandma," Caleb said, with the guileless honesty of someone young enough to still find the entire pattern genuinely strange rather than simply normal. "Why do you let them do all this stuff with your phone and your house and everything? It's your life." Caleb, settling into a kitchen chair, went on in the easy, unfiltered way of someone still young enough to say the obvious thing out loud without worrying about hurting anyone's feelings. He mentioned noticing on this same visit that Nadine's living room looked different than he remembered from childhood visits, that her phone seemed oddly stripped down compared to what he'd expect from someone who used to show him proudly all sorts of photo editing tricks on her old device. "You used to be the cool grandma who knew how to do stuff on her phone before anyone else did," he said. "Now it's like somebody dumbed it down for you. No offense, but that's kind of backwards." The question landed with unexpected force. arriving from someone entirely outside the usual family dynamics, unfiltered by any of the accumulated politeness and caution that had built up gradually between Nadine and her own two children. That evening, after Caleb left, Nadine sat alone in her living room, the one with the newer non-slip mat instead of her beloved Santa Fe rug, and finally allowed herself to see the full pattern clearly, laid out end to end, rather than experienced as 7 separate, individually forgivable moments. Her phone, altered without her real input, her house, quietly redecorated around her own preferences, her shopping, dependent on approval she'd never actually asked for, her pottery studio, restructured according to someone else's logic, her own household decisions, discussed and nearly finalized before she was even consulted, her own memories, gently corrected by people who hadn't lived them, and underneath all of it, the quiet, corrosive habit of censoring herself preemptively, defending decisions nobody had even questioned yet. She called Dolores that night, and the two friends talked for nearly 2 hours, Nadine describing the full pattern out loud for the first time, Dolores listening with the particular clarity of someone who had noticed pieces of it from the outside for months. "I think you've been slowly disappearing from your own house, Nadine," Dolores said gently, not because anyone's cruel, because it's easier in the moment to just accept the changes than to keep pushing back on well-meaning people who love you. Dolores, an artist herself, offered her own perspective from decades of watching other friends in their circle navigate similar territory as they aged. "I've seen this happen to almost everyone I know eventually, in one form or another," she said. "The kids mean well every single time. That's what makes it so hard to fight. You can't get angry at someone for loving you too efficiently. But efficient love, applied without asking first, is still something that needs pushing back against, Nadine. Otherwise, it just keeps expanding quietly into every corner of your life." In the days that followed, Nadine began deliberately reversing each sign one at a time. She sat down with her phone one Saturday morning and, with the patient help of a young employee at the local electronics store, rather than either of her children, reconfigured it entirely to her own preferences, the news app restored, notifications set exactly how she wanted them, her actual daily habits reflected rather than someone else's idea of simplicity. The young employee, perhaps not much older than Caleb himself, asked her a simple question that struck Nadine as almost radical in its directness. "What do you actually use your phone for day to day?" Nobody in the entire process of Owen's original setup had ever asked her that. She walked the employee through her actual habits, checking the morning news, editing pottery photos, texting her small circle of friends, occasionally looking up a recipe, and watched him build a home screen that reflected her real life, rather than an outsider's assumptions about what an older woman's phone probably ought to look like. She called Renata and asked directly and without accusation whether her mother's rocking chair and the Santa Fe rug still existed somewhere, perhaps in Renata's own garage or storage unit. They did. Nadine arranged to bring both items home the following weekend, placing them back exactly where they belonged. She bought a new sweater the following week without sending a single photo to anyone first, feeling a small private thrill at trusting her own judgment again after 2 years of quiet, unnecessary deference. She dismantled Owen's carefully constructed pottery schedule, thanking him for the thoughtful intention behind it while explaining clearly that unstructured time was the entire point of her studio practice, not an oversight to be corrected. When Owen and Renata next mentioned any decision touching her own household, a repair, a service, a purchase, Nadine made a point of asking directly, plainly, "Has this actually been discussed with me yet? Or is this still just the two of you talking?" At the next family dinner, when Owen began to gently correct one of her stories, Nadine simply said, warmly but firmly, "I was there, sweetheart. I remember this one clearly." She noticed, saying it, how strange it felt to need to say something so basic out loud, and how necessary it apparently still was. And she made a conscious effort in the weeks that followed to stop rehearsing explanations for decisions nobody had actually questioned, catching herself mid-preparation on more than one occasion and deliberately setting the impulse aside. Nadine eventually sat down with both Owen and Renata together, describing the full pattern she'd identified, calmly and without accusation, much the way she'd once carefully critiqued a student's artwork, pointing out exactly what she saw without attacking the person who created it. "I don't think either of you meant any of this unkindly," she told them. "But somewhere over the past couple of years, I started feeling like a guest in my own life, constantly needing approval for things that used to just be mine to decide." Owen looked genuinely stricken. "Mom, I thought I was helping. The phone, the studio schedule. I really believed I was making things easier for you." "I know," Nadine said. "That's exactly what makes it so easy to miss. None of it looked like control. It just looked like help, over and over until there wasn't much left that was still entirely mine." Renata, quieter, finally spoke. "The house things. I really did think I was just updating things that needed updating. I didn't think about what it would feel like to lose your own mother's chair without ever being asked first." Nadine reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. "I understand where it came from, sweetheart. I'm not angry. I just need us to build a different habit going forward. You asking me first, rather than deciding first and explaining afterward." The conversation, though difficult, ended with something Nadine hadn't fully expected. Genuine relief on all three sides, the particular relief that comes from finally naming a pattern that had been operating silently, unexamined, for far too long. Nadine's story is still unfolding, several weeks into her own deliberate process of reclaiming the small daily authorship of her own life. It is worth telling precisely because none of the 7 signs taken individually would have seemed alarming to almost anyone observing from outside. Together they formed a pattern that took a 19-year-old's blunt honesty and an old friend's outside perspective to finally bring into focus. It is worth noting, too, that the pattern Nadine experienced says less about any particular flaw in Owen or Renata and more about how naturally competence and care can slide into quiet control when a family never explicitly discusses where the line between the two should sit. Owen's engineering instinct toward optimization, Renata's professional eye for design. Both were genuinely admirable skills, applied with real love. The trouble was never the skills themselves. It was the absence of any conversation about whether Nadine actually wanted them applied to her own daily life in the first place. If any of Nadine's 7 signs feel familiar, here is what her experience can teach us. Pay attention if your personal devices have been altered by someone else without your full input and approval. Convenience decided on your behalf is not the same thing as convenience you actually chose. Notice changes to your own home's decor or belongings made without genuine consultation. Your space remains yours to shape, regardless of who has the more current sense of style or safety standards. Recognize if you've started seeking approval for simple personal purchases you once made confidently on your own. Trust in your own taste doesn't expire with age. Check whether your hobbies and free time have been restructured for someone else's convenience or peace of mind, rather than genuinely serving your own preferences. Insist on being the first to know about any decision concerning your own household or daily routine, not the last person consulted after the fact. Notice when your own stories and memories start being quietly corrected by people who didn't actually live them. Your history belongs to you, told in your own words. And most importantly, watch for the moment you start censoring or explaining yourself preemptively before anyone has actually asked a single question. That quiet, internal shift is often the clearest sign of all. Nadine's Santa Fe rug is back on her living room floor. Her mother's rocking chair creaks again in its familiar corner. Her phone finally works the way she actually wants it to, and when she drives home after an evening pottery class now, she simply drives home, without composing an explanation for a question nobody has ever actually needed to ask. Caleb, back at college now, still texts her occasionally, checking in with the same easy directness that first cracked the pattern open. "How's the phone, Grandma? Did you get your stuff back?" he asked recently. Nadine, sitting in her studio with clay still under her fingernails, no clock ticking anywhere nearby, wrote back simply, "Got it all back. Thank you for asking the question nobody else thought to ask." Which of these 7 signs have you noticed in your own life? Tell us in the comments below and let us know what city or country you're watching from tonight. Someone else quietly rehearsing an explanation right now for a decision that was always entirely theirs to make might need to read your answer. If Nadine's story meant something to you, subscribe to Better with Time for more stories from the Dignity Years, because the quietest signs are often the ones most worth noticing before they become the loudest regrets.